a lot of statistics have shown, and research has shown, that somewhere around close to 90% of employees believe that one of the number one issues inside their company is for managers to hold team members accountable. Holding others accountable is a huge issue that employees have spotlighted. Now, what I also think is almost more important is 69% of employees that were polled said they are not reaching their potential at work. And so when we create cultures of accountability, it really is not about punitive. It's about elevating expectations so everyone reaches their potential and teams reach their potential and what they're capable of. This is the Leadership Foundry podcast. I'm your co-host this week, Brandon Smith. And our topic this week, it's like a lot of our topics, it's somewhat evergreen, but this topic is one that I am finding, and we are finding, more and more of our clients are asking for. For whatever reason, this has become a very hot topic in the last few years. Randy and I have talked about it a few times, and I've been teaching a course on that, actually a mini session on this for one of our clients this year. And the topic is accountability. So in other words, as leaders, how do we create a culture of accountability? And how do we hold our team members accountable? This is tricky. And probably what's made this so relevant is that now that we're juggling working from home, back to the office, figuring out how we hold people accountable in that environment is a little more challenging, because it's a little easier. We can see folks working next to you, see how they approach work, and give them feedback. But when they're remote, it can be a little trickier. I had a client of mine several years ago, and he was working with his team, and his team was all remote. And they particularly what they do is around kind of security for this business. And they were kind of building their command center out of one of their locations. And they were all working remote, and he thought everything was fine. And as soon as the command center was built and everybody kind of came in there, was working every day in person, he quickly noticed. He said, "Oh yeah, this one coworker over here is just on the phone all the time, working and making calls and checking in on things. This other person next to him is just drinking coffee, waiting for things to come." So accountability can be really tricky when we've got a mix of hybrid. So our conversation today is going to be all about how do we do that. And I've got a 3-step process for us today that I'm going to go down. Now, joining us on the conversation is my wonderful co-host and producer, Whitney Mendoza. Whitney, how are you?
Good, Brandon. How are you?
I am well. So accountability, what is your, and it's okay, I want you to give me your honest answer. What's your first reaction when you hear the word accountability?
So I wrote down, I love that we're calling this culture of accountability, because I think that's a key. It's a culture in the workplace. But I wrote down the note that there are 6 generations in the workplace. And so some of us millennials are getting a bad rep, and we just all work a little bit differently. And, fill in the blank. That was my first thought.
Yeah.
All those 90s kids, they're different from us 80s babies.
Yeah. All a little different. I saw kind of a funny, humorous kind of reel on this, and it had, boomers all ready to go for work, and they're leaving for work at like 5:30 in the morning,
Yeah.
And Gen Xers kind of like, they kind of cruise out to work more like 7:30 or 8, kind of ready to go, a little grumpy, but ready to go. Millennials, it's like, yeah, I'll get in around 9:30, 10. And then Gen Z and Gen Alpha are like, I don't know if I'm going to go in today, or exactly when I'm going to go in. So different expectations and how work should go and what the norm should be. And I'm not saying anyone is right or wrong, but consistency is important for a team. So, and once we establish that, holding people accountable is important, because otherwise we're going to end up with folks strolling on in at noon, some folks coming on in at 6 a.m., some folks coming on in at 9, 10. That inconsistency is going to cause problems. Everybody comes in at 9, fine. Everybody comes in at noon, fine. But the inconsistency is going to have people resentful and upset. And part of why this matters so much is when we don't hold folks accountable and create that culture of accountability, the number one group that gets the most hurt and causes the most problems for us is going to be our A players, because they're saying, hey, why do they get away with this? Why aren't you holding, if you're not going to hold them accountable, and I'm held to this standard and they're held to that standard, I'm going to go find something else. And we lose our A players. And as we all know, that's not okay. We have enough challenges. We can't have our A players walk out the door. So a culture of accountability is really, really important. Now, one more reason why I'm going to set this up, it matters so much. A lot of statistics have shown, and research has shown, that somewhere around close to 90% of employees believe that one of the number one issues inside their company is for managers to hold team members accountable. Holding others accountable is a huge issue that employees have spotlighted. Now, what I also think is almost more important is 69% of employees that were polled said they are not reaching their potential at work. And so when we create cultures of accountability, it really is not about punitive. It's about elevating expectations so everyone reaches their potential and teams reach their potential and what they're capable of. So I want people to reframe and rethink this term accountability and think of it more as a positive thing, all about helping potential be achieved, rather than we're going to punish folks that aren't doing what they need to be doing. Okay, so Whitney, are you ready for our 3-step process for creating a culture of accountability?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I have my pen and my notebook.
Excellent. So our first step in the process is we've got to drive clarity of expectations. Clarity is the first step. So let me explain why that is the case, and then I'll tell you what I mean by driving clarity. If we don't tell folks what we expect of them and then hold them accountable to something we never said out loud, you are really going to create a lot of frustration. You are going to set up people for failure. So a few years ago, I was having lunch with a nonprofit leader, and this is common in the nonprofit world. The leader was saying to me, it's been years since we did any kind of performance reviews. We just really kind of lost the rhythm. Very common in the nonprofit world. Most nonprofits either don't do performance reviews or do them very inconsistently. It's just part of the nature of that world. It's not a healthy process and practice, by the way. We want to have that feedback mechanism in order to create this culture of accountability. But regardless, the leader said to me, I haven't done it in years. I've decided I'm doing all the performance reviews next week. And she was very proud of herself. And I said, don't you dare do that. That's a really bad idea. You are going to create a huge problem with your team, and it's going to be a mess that's going to take you a long time to unwind. And she looked at me kind of confused, like, what are you talking about? I thought performance reviews and feedback were good. And I went on to explain why. I said, look, you haven't been telling them what you've been expecting of them. And then now you're going to all of a sudden drop performance reviews and give people 3 out of 5s, 2 out of 5s. They are going to be furious because all these people, particularly in nonprofit land, are going to say, I'm doing a great job. I'm a 5 out of 5 on everything. You can't hold them accountable unless you sit down first and say, here's what I expect. So I basically said to her, we can do performance reviews in exactly 6 months to a year. But the first thing you need to be doing tomorrow is sharing your expectations. So let's talk about what I mean by clear expectations. So when we talk about clear expectations, we'll start first with the role, making sure everyone understands what you expect of them in their role. So what's their job, what's within their scope, what's outside their scope, what's in their lane, what's outside their lane, what can they make decisions on, what do they need to bring to you, and kind of what are they essentially responsible for. And role clarity is really important because it helps people understand this is your sandbox in which you can kind of build sandcastles. Okay. That's the first part. The second part is expectations around what success looks like. Okay. So the role might be client management, for example, but success might mean losing 0 clients this year, or maybe it's acquiring clients, or maybe it's only losing 20% of clients. I don't know what the metrics are. It's going to vary, but it helps them understand exactly how high and what shape should that sandcastle be. So while the role is the sandbox, the expectations of success are really what the sandcastle should look like. So you're setting that up with them really, really well. And you're also trying to create an environment where they can ask clear clarifying questions of you. They can say, well, help me understand a little bit more about the size and shape of that sandcastle, or what exactly you mean by 20% increase in sales. Where should that come from? And what wouldn't count as that? So asking those clarifying questions. So making sure everybody understands up front is important. The last thing you could add, if you want around clarity of expectations, is also around the clarity of how you want people working. So we've shared kind of the role, we've shared what success would look like, and then now kind of the values or culture. Because we don't necessarily want a leader that maybe does a great job on their role and expectations and hits success metrics, but throws lots of elbows and steps on toes along the way. So we need to make sure they understand, here's what we mean by kind of the team environment. So those are all ways that we can drive clarity, but clarity is our first step. And it's an important step because and listen real close to this, if you are really effective at driving clarity around roles, goals, ways of working, when you do that really, really well, 80% of your people will step up to that. So all of a sudden, you only have 20% that you're going to have other conversations with. 80% are going to step right up to that. They just want to know what you expect, and they want to make you happy. Frankly, it's their job. They want to please their leader and manager because that's just good kind of professional hygiene. So you'll only have to deal with 20% in our next two steps if you do the first step well. So Whitney, any reactions to that first step?
The picture I got in my mind when you were sharing that story about that leader that was like, well, we haven't really been clarifying what we want, the goals we want to achieve. But by the way, we're going to do 360 interviews tomorrow
Performance reviews. Yeah.
Performance reviews. Thank you. Tomorrow, when we haven't done them in like the last however many years. The thought was like when it was movie day in school. Oh. And that's what you would get, like the whole class, you got to watch a movie and everyone loved it. And so that means the lights went off. And so for like, I don't know, an hour you were in class watching a movie. And then all of a sudden the teacher flipped the lights back on without any warning. And the entire class is doing this, like, I'm blinded by the light look on their face. That's how that feels to your team.
Yes. And they won't take it well.
Yeah, they're totally caught off guard. And so I mean, before you can do that and even scale and track how successful the team has been, they have to know, okay, well, what am I aspiring to?
100%. That's so critical. They've got to know that. And you may need to say it more than once. So that's also important too. And making sure they understand is important. So I'll talk a little more about this in the next step, but it's not inappropriate. In fact, I might recommend that after you have that conversation where you set expectations, you end the conversation this way. Hey, I know we've covered a lot of ground today. I want to make sure that I'm communicating effectively and I'm not missing anything. I'm just curious, what did you take away from our conversation today? And so it's a gentle way of saying to the person, hey, why don't you tell me what you just heard? Or repeat back to me what I said. You're saying it in a very kind, respectful way, but it's important because we want to ensure understanding. If they don't understand, then you're going to end up with problems down the road because they're going to be guessing, and sometimes they're going to guess right and sometimes they're going to guess wrong. So don't be afraid to end conversations with team members with some kind of request for them to play back to you what they heard or their takeaways.
No,
all right. Are you ready for the next step?
Ready.
Okay, here we go. All right. So we have driven clarity. Everyone knows what the role is, goals, how we want them to work together. The next step is we want to make sure we're maintaining momentum by keeping that conversation going in positive ways by providing reinforcing feedback and creating an environment where folks can ask questions. We don't want a culture of accountability to feel like people are kind of being watched or judged. We don't want that environment. That's not a culture of accountability. That's more like a prison cell. So we don't really want that. We want folks to feel comfortable to say, hey, I'm struggling with this, or hey, can you help me out with this? We want to create an environment where author editor works, where folks can kind of author things for you to edit. And so to do that, first, we got to make sure we're driving psychological safety. And so that could be a whole other conversation, but the short version of this is psychological safety is our way of making sure that folks feel comfortable enough to come to us with either bad news or questions or challenges, knowing they're not going to get punished. And so we do that by checking in with them, but we also do that by sharing our own vulnerability. So making sure that they understand, hey, I've been in the seat you're in. I've had challenges before. Let me tell you about a mistake I made when I was about in the same role you're in right now. And in case you come into that situation, come to me. Let's talk about it. So I think that's one. The second way you can also encourage psychological safety is regularly checking in. How are things going? I know we've talked about kind of goals and expectations. Anything you need from me in terms of support, whether that's resources or guidance, because after all, that's part of our job as managers, not only providing the proper tools and resources, but also the proper guidance and direction on what we want. The rest of it is up to our team members. But our job as managers are those two things. The third thing we want to make sure we're also doing in those conversations is we're providing proper feedback. And for our conversation here today, I want to emphasize positive feedback. So when we see folks hitting the mark, we see folks hitting those expectations we've laid out, called out in the moment. That's fantastic. That's exactly what we're talking about. I love the way Sonia delivered on this report for the client. And not only was it responsive and quick, she did it in a way that is so consistent with how we want to treat our clients that this is like a role model for all the rest of the ways we should be handling our clients, providing that positive feedback. So when research has been done around positive feedback, they found that the highest performing teams had a ratio of 5 positive interactions for every 1 negative interaction. They're not only providing each other positive feedback, but they've got inside jokes, and they've got other things, other interactions that keep the team feeling supported and connected. Because when research has been focusing in on that negative feedback, they have found that 1 piece of negative feedback is equal to 3 pieces of positive. So another way of saying it is 1 piece of negative feedback is 3 times heavier than positive feedback. Carries more of a punch. So if we're only giving negative feedback, people are going to get frustrated and demoralized. We don't want that. So we want the positive feedback. Now, for some of you listening to this, positive feedback feels like cheerleading. It's like, I don't want to be a cheerleader. I'm too serious for that. It's not cheerleading. It can be, but that's not what we're using it for here today. I want to be really clear. When we give positive feedback, this is behavioral psychology 101. This is Pavlov's dog kind of stuff. We're reinforcing the positive behaviors that we've seen that we want to see more of. That's why you give positive feedback. When you don't give positive feedback, you're running into one of my communication principles. In absence of communication, people assume the worst. So Sonia's done this great thing with a client. We don't say anything. Sonia goes, well, I guess Brandon wasn't happy with that, or maybe that wasn't good enough, or was that exactly what he wanted? And so maybe Sonia goes back the next time and iterates and tries something different, and it's not good. And had she just stuck with her approach she did with this client that she just delivered on, that would have been great. But we never gave her the feedback, so she doesn't know, so she keeps changing and iterating. Don't let that happen. When you see the behavior you want, nail it down and go, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Everybody needs to do that. So it's really about reinforcing those behaviors. So we're creating that culture of what we expect. Because if we get enough people doing it, it's going to invite some of the folks that are our latecomers to join that, and they're going to follow along. And it might help some of the folks that really aren't good culture fits to self-select out of the team, which is a lot better than us needing to select them out on our own. So those are just some ways to think about it, but it's really important that we create not only that environment of psychological safety, but we also create that space for folks to get that positive feedback, and we're looking for that and noticing that. Last thing I'll add to this, you can turn that into a process. You can have a process for feedback too. So if your team accomplishes like a group project together, you'll never find a world-class team on this planet. You won't find one that doesn't have some kind of a process, a debrief process at the end of a big event. In the military, they call it after-action reviews. In the medical world, they call them postmortems. They're called retrospectives in the consulting world and other environments. Even Olympic teams have their own version of this. So being able to pause and say what worked, what didn't, what can we learn? Another great way for reinforcing accountability and reinforcing the idea that we're going to pause and reflect on every activity. And that's how we get better. All right. So Whitney, that's our second stop on the journey. And by the way, if we've done that second stop well, we are going to capture 95% now of our team. So we captured 80% with the first stop. We're going to capture another 15% of that 100, another 15 points in that second stop. So now we're up to 95%. You do 1 and 2 well, you're only going to have about 5% of folks that you need to have the uncomfortable conversations which will be our last stop. So any thoughts or reactions to the second stop?
Yeah, I was having lunch just yesterday with another business colleague, and we were discussing this thought that most humans don't ask for what they want. But yet we walk away from any interaction or engagement and we're upset because the other person didn't perceive our thoughts and they didn't just assume what we wanted. And so I love pointing it back to the fact that both parties here are responsible. The leader needs to create that environment of psychological safety, but then you as the direct report have to take accountability. You have to take ownership and to ask follow-up questions if you still feel like there's something that's unclear or something that you didn't understand. You need to ask for that.
Yeah, I think I love the fact that you're also putting it on the direct reports too, to make sure, hey, you've got to take ownership in this. And that's right. Because at the end of the day, accountability is ownership's another word. And those of you that have heard me talk about author editor, you know, that's one of the traits of the author is ownership, initiative, and critical thinking. And that's a form of accountability, personal accountability. And we're trying to drive that and create a culture. Because ultimately, if you got a culture of accountability, you really don't have to hold anybody accountable. The culture will operate on its own, and it will create an environment where people take on self-accountability or ownership. And the leaders don't have to keep driving that and pushing on that. And so also a really important thing. So even I'll use an example with my kiddos. So, you know, my daughter Abby's 23 and she's graduated from college. She's got a great job and with a big consulting firm. And then Noah's going through college. He's a sophomore. He's 20. And then Aaron's 18 and he's a senior in high school. And, you know, we put an expectation and a culture of accountability around grades. And so you hear me say that and you're probably thinking, okay, he and his wife were like locked down on that. No, I never saw one kind of report card. In fact, I don't think I ever saw a report card of any of my kids in the entire time of them going through school, ever. Now, I'm weird on that. We also don't have Life 360. We don't believe in Life 360 because that's just another way to that's over accountability. Now we're getting like now we're kind of hovering, right? No, the culture of accountability is your grades are your grades. If you have these kinds of goals, we're going to help you get there. But ultimately, you're responsible for your grades because you're responsible for your effort. And if you change your effort and don't deliver the grades you want, then if you want these, then you can't have these colleges. You're going to have these colleges. And that's going to be an outcome from you. So there was a culture of accountability, personal accountability for all my kids. And kind of Abby set that standard, Noah reinforced that standard, and Aaron just is following along with that standard. And he's and his grades and scores are probably higher than actually the first two. But we never had to do anything because the culture was just kind of set. So I would use that as an example to say, wouldn't we like that for all of our teams where it's just kind of understood? This is the way we work around here. And we don't have to be hovering and monitoring and asking, you know, why did you leave work 5 minutes early? We don't have to do that because who wants to do that? And who wants a leader doing that? So another way to think about it.
Right. Absolutely.
Okay. One more stop on our journey. I'm going to make this one short and quick. That's for that 5%. This is our last stop. This is where we protect our culture of accountability. We protect our culture by having those conversations. Okay? I've had to have some of these at home with my kids when there were missteps or slips, when I've had to pull them aside and said, let's have a serious conversation about where you're at. But we do the same thing with our team members, and we'll have that team member that's just not getting it. So when we're about to have that conversation, we need to do a gut check first and say, have I been clear on my expectations? Do they have the resources they need to be successful? Have I provided them any kind of support, training, anything else? And then if we can check off those, then we need to have the conversation. And the conversation is very simple. We basically remind them and refresh them on the conversations we've already had, on the expectations that have been set, talk about where they currently are, talk about that gap, and say, all right, so what are we going to do about this? Now, a couple important points around this conversation. First, if you're like me, I can get a little hot under the collar when I see folks kind of dropping the ball and they've kind of missed things that we've talked about. And so don't have the conversation if you're a little heated. If you're emotionally charged up, not a good time to do it. Schedule a time so you both can be prepared. And it doesn't have to be scary. You can simply say, hey, I want to sit down with you and let's talk about kind of how you're doing, current performance, expectations, and where you'd like to see this go. And I've got some thoughts that might be helpful. So frame it that way. But the reason why we don't want to do it when we're heated is because when we're heated, the only thing that person hears when they have that meeting is our emotion and not the substance. So they leave the meeting and they go down the hall and somebody says, well, what happened? And then they said, I don't know. I don't know what Brandon was talking about, but he was really mad. That's not the outcome we want. So we want to make sure that we've scheduled time. We're coming in really prepared and thoughtful. The last thing and second thing I want to add to this is that it goes back to author editor. And if you haven't either read the book or heard the podcast, go back and look at some of our prior podcasts around author editor. It's a real simple concept, but the idea is when you do have someone you've got to hold accountable who's missing the mark, don't write the plan for them. Don't say, here's the plan I want you to follow from now on. They're not going to buy in. They need to go write the plan. So here's the gap. Have the conversation about where they want to go and say, why don't you go back, put together a plan on how you want to get from here to there. Bring it to me. Let's talk about it so I know how I can support you. They need to write the plan, because when they write the plan, accountability goes up by 50%. Okay, if we write the plan, they're just going to kind of, at best, just kind of going to go through the motions. We want ownership, initiative, and critical thinking, because when they write the plan, we're activating those behaviors. And if we do that, it's going to make it a lot clearer and a lot easier too for us to see how bought in they are. So those conversations don't have to be scary. Make it positive, but you want to make sure you have those. Don't avoid those, because remember, we avoid those conversations with the people slipping. All the other high performers are going to say, well, what's this? You're holding me to this standard, and you're not going to hold them, and they get to kind of slack off. That's not fair. And we don't want that to be the culture that we set. So, Whitney, those are our 3 steps on the journey. Any reactions or reflections to our last step?
Yeah, love the last one. It's kind of like the workplace version of there's no free lunch. If you just them free, they're not going to buy in, and that's just, it's going to make for the process to be unsuccessful in the end.
Yeah. Agreed. And you're trying to create an environment so when they are off track, they come to you. And so you want that also to be the spirit of that last conversation.
Right.
Now, we haven't talked about how many chances to give folks, but if you do a good job on driving those clear expectations and we have them do that come up with a plan, if they miss the mark on the plan they create, it's going to be a lot easier to say, hey, we've talked about this, and now you've kind of missed the mark. So I'll end with this. I had a session I was doing on this recently, and I had a member in the audience come up, a leader, and she came up to me and she said, I got this problem. What if people keep missing the mark? What do I do? And I love that idea, because what happens is we naturally, whether we're managers, leaders, parents, we tend to be like, I got to fix this. It's all on me. Mm-hmm. And I said to her, I tell you what you do. You say to them, hey, this is the 3rd time you missed the mark. I'm curious. What are you going to do to fix this? Just directly ask the question. This is on you. What are you going to do to fix this? Again, going back to parenting, I'm a little weird in maybe my parenting approaches, but when Abby and Noah, my oldest two, would have conflicts, even when they were little, I would say, I'm not going to intercede in this. You two need to fix this. And I would send them off to one of the rooms and close the door. I said, go into that room, close the door. You work out some kind of agreement, come back, and then we can talk about it. I put it on them to figure it out because I wanted them to be able to author those kinds of solutions and not have me author it, because if I'm authoring it, they're going to edit it. And they were 10 and 8 years old, and I'm not going to give them editing rights on my plan. So I said, why don't you go off and do that? And that helped them develop those skills. All right. So Whitney, I'm going to land our plane today because this is a rich conversation and an important one. And I would hope that everybody took away something in this today. So the goal of this idea of culture of accountability isn't that you have to know all those steps. It's really for you to think about, is there one of those steps that maybe you've been a little more loose on recently? A lot of those things I shared with you are not rocket science. You probably knew a lot of those. But I'm sure if you're like most leaders, we maybe let one or two of those slip a little. So is there one of those you want to tighten up in 2025? Because with our podcast, as always here at the Leadership Foundry, the goal is for you to take away something from one of these shows that you can put in place into your leadership toolkit starting today that's going to help you and your team and the rest of the folks in your life thrive tomorrow.